that's true. How old are you?
23, almost 24.
Nice.
What's up, Twitch? We're streaming on two platforms for the first time, so let me know if you guys can hear through this mic. This might be a little low on this one, but try to work with it.
You mean the angle or the mic?
No, I just mean the mic since I'm not mic'd through there.
I can put it closer to you if you want.
So you're not coming up on my list. It's like my phone.
It should start soon. I just turned it on a second ago. I'll wait for just a sec, guys, and just to get confirmation that both platforms are up. This is cool. Now I can actually watch it on mine and look at the questions.
I got an email saying you're live on Twitch.
I can't seem to find it on Facebook though.
Let me see. It doesn't look like it.
But we are. Do you guys see it on Twitch?
I don't see it. I don't have you.
I'll check my email. It says you're live. Yeah, totally see it.
Twitch is good?
Yep.
Okay, I'm not really sure what's going on with the Facebook, but we'll just roll with it.
Although this is what I'm seeing. You're barely in the screen. Getting all that other jazz.
Yeah, see, I don't even have you at all. There it is.
Twitch is good? We'll ask the guys real quick. I'm not really sure what's going on with the Facebook, but we'll just roll with it.
Although this is what I'm seeing. You're barely in the screen. Getting all that other jazz.
Do either of you have the Twitch chat pulled up?
I will in a minute.
Alright, cool.
Gotta wait for the advertisement.
So I wanted to start off with just this post that I saw that got made on the blog below the last post that I made. I asked guys to just post whatever questions they had below my latest post, and I would just try to get to as many as I could. And this guy is saying props to Nick, but I want to say thank you to him because it's the only guy who, through the shitstorm of all the stuff that's been posted on my blog in the last month, chose to point out that, like, I basically have more free content from Twitch streams posted on YouTube than any other high stakes coach. And if that's not enough for you to make a decision about whether or not you want to pursue the type of path that I'm advocating, I don't really know what else could be more of a reason to figure it out for yourself. Like, the reason that stuff is there, the reason that I put it there is so that everybody can basically decide. And I just thought it was funny that through all of the shit that was posted in the last 2 weeks or so, like all of the flack, this was the first guy to point out that there's actually a way to decide for free whether or not you want to pursue the type of learning path that I'm into, which brings me into the trend of today's conversation. I don't see any way around it. This is going to be a talk about extreme ownership, just to quote the YouTube video from yesterday. A friend of mine sent me a link to a podcast, and someone who was mentioned in the podcast had a TED Talk called Extreme Ownership. Randomly, I just followed the trail and got there. His name is Jocko Willink, and he's a retired Navy SEAL officer. And this TED Talk that he gave was really moving to me because it was about how he found himself uh, at the top of the chain of command in a Navy SEAL operation where there was a friendly fire incident, and someone had to answer for it after all was said and done. And the whole talk was about how before he headed into the briefing room, he was trying to figure out who he was going to assign blame to, and he was going down the list and saying, this guy did this wrong, this guy did this wrong. And basically right before he jumped in to the briefing, he threw his list out, and he basically pointed at every SEAL in the room when he went in, and he said basically, whose fault was this? And each SEAL raised his hand and said, it was my fault, I did this, it was my fault, I could have done this better. And finally Jocko says, no, it was none of your faults, it was my fault. I'm at the top of the chain of command, and every single thing that happened falls on me. So the whole point of the talk was, albeit extreme and not like a real world situation, it's probably the most intense situation that could make it really clear how important it is to have people taking full ownership of their actions if problems are going to get solved. So I'm going to just preface with this, that this is going to come up in a lot of the questions that I answer, and I'm almost going to try to answer every single question on this level, sort of like the game that we've been playing today. We're hanging out at my house. Logan and Alan are both here from the CFP program, and we've been really talking a lot about patterns that consistently sabotage guys, and this underlying trend has been that guys are not taking full responsibility for their careers, and they're constantly looking for how to place blame outside of themselves so that they can avoid what is the real problem, which is themselves. So that being said, I'll start off technical, and I'm guessing it'll naturally trend into it like it always does. This guy from the blog, his question was, could you maybe talk about some good bluff catching spots? I know there's a lot of spots where the pool's over folding versus aggression, but I know very little about how I should be calling down wide. Do you want to try this one first, Logan? Just from so being a student of the type of program I teach, how would you envision bluff catching in one sentence in terms of like, how do you feel like you've developed your understanding of good spots to bluff catch? What's the first thing that comes to your mind?
The first thing that comes to my mind is bluff allowance.
Okay, cool. So he says bluff allowance, which is a term we use for identifying when an opponent's range has a certain amount of bluffs in it on the river that would allow it to over bluff easily. So it's an extension of understanding range versus range interaction at a subtler level. I don't really think you can study this until you're already at a pretty good integration.
I agree.
I think it's something that comes in later in the development of a player. And I should probably tie this into the podcast that I was initially watching that led me to that Jocko Willing thing was one on Tim Ferriss. A friend of mine, Matt Berkey, sent it to me, and he said, you got to watch this. It's on accelerated learning. And I liked how Ferriss talked about the 3 pillars of how he constructs training programs or accelerated learning patterns. The acronym is DSS, deconstruction, then structure, and then sequencing. I think that's it. Where the structure and sequencing part is sort of what we're talking about when we're saying, how do you get to understanding of good bluff catching spots? Well, you have to sort of work your way into it through understanding range versus range interaction at a subtler level, which unfortunately is not something that you can really get to until you have strong metrics in just earlier parts of the game tree, I would say.
There's just almost no blanket statement that can,
The reason is that it's pertaining mostly to the river. And although I think most of our win rates coming from the river in the way that I train, you can't get to the river until you understand how to get there simply. So really what my course looks like right now, and we're sort of continuing to dial it as we go, but it's very much a course of get them to the river as metric oriented as possible, take as much guesswork out of the preliminary streets as possible by showing them here's a strategy that's been organized from massive amounts of data compressed into metrics that should naturally exploit the pool while understanding and developing equilibrium strategy along the way. In other words, the player learns the metrics understanding that they're exploitative while still developing his understanding of equilibrium. And then eventually we arrive at the river where subtlety of range versus range interaction can develop in a way that allows you to spot where the opponent has more bluffs than usual on certain textures. So basically, it's a pattern recognition thing at that stage. Once you're there, the best way to study is to go in depth with certain board textures and try to find trends, basically. What is the trend or pattern of this board texture that leads the villain to have a higher than usual amount of bluffs in this line that he could potentially unload with? So the way I like to visualize this is to think about it in terms of a gradient, where you have black on one side, white on the other side, gray in the middle. So in this zone, we're talking about bluff catching. In the gradient zone of bluff catching, we're going to start from the black and white ends through pattern recognition and just natural intuitive exploration. And we're going to hunt around for spots where there seem to be a lot of EV gains available just by being able to point out, oh, here's a spot where the guy actually gets to the river with an extraordinary high amount of bluffs, and it might be very easy for him to overshoot his bluffing frequency if he's not very careful. If you hunt around for spots like that, and this is, some of it can be on intuitive guidance and some of it's just straight up luck, but this is one of the best ways to use PO Solver, is to hunt for these types of patterns that are occurring and to see where the solver has to be very careful about how many bluffs it unloads. These spots exist all the time where you'll see that the way that the range is constructed to the river, the solver is checking back some pretty unusual hands at a high frequency, stuff that would be very easy to unload otherwise to the untrained eye. And then those become sort of your priority zones. So the way that strategy development works, the way I perceive this is in terms of accelerating and prioritizing. If you want to reference Pareto's law, I think it's called, which is the 80-20 thing. 80% of the results come from 20% of the textures. 20% of the textures are real hotspot zones for being able to bluff catch more efficiently. So if a player is able to prioritize those zones in a way that gives him a way to set it up to study it efficiently, I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. So that part is sort of hit or miss pattern recognition. And if you have a lot of eyes on it, it's better. A lot of manpower to be able to have guys that are saying, oh, here's a spot, here's a spot. Some guys on my team, one of the things that they're best at is the methodology of hunting for stuff like that. And then we end up with an archive of all these different spots. And then from there, it's about pattern recognizing and breaking it down into a methodology that then sequences it. So the sequencing of this would be, what are the highest win rate zones that we've found for bluff catching efficiently on rivers? We go to the archive and we say, okay, well, here are sort of the green light zones. Just to bring some context to it, we call it basically green light or code red zones. Code red being, these are really bad spots to bluff catch because the guy doesn't really get there with enough bluffs that he could unload recklessly even if he bluffed very frequently. That's what Logan's referring to when he talks about bluff allowance. Bluff allowance is basically the number that we use to represent how many of the opponent's bluffs in his range he would be allowed to use before he's over bluffing. So a low bluff allowance texture would indicate that it's a good spot to bluff catch because the player is not allowed to bluff very often before he overshoots his bluffing frequency. On the other extreme, a very high bluff allowance of say 100 would mean that the villain's range is improved to such a degree that he could turn every unpaired hand into a bluff and not be over bluffing. Awful spots to bluff catch. So if you do this properly, and it's one of the things that we've been trying to like dial in really carefully into the program as we begin to go into subtler and subtler territory, you end up with basically a workbook of zones that trend toward gray area. You're taking the largest win rate chunks of the black and white ends of the gradient and just trending on in until you hit a gray enough area where you have to consider whether or not another zone is worth your time. I think this is a really important part of strategy development, is that there's a maturity that's necessary to be able to distinguish, is there still win rate available and going deeper into the gray area of this current zone, call it bluff catching efficiency on the river, or is my time better spent going off into another zone where there might be bigger chunks in the black and white that I can break off? And there's no real formula for that. I just think it's sort of an intuition thing for me, that like if I'm feeling more and more comfortable in a certain zone, then it's the beginning of a signal to me that I no longer need to spend as much focus there. It might be better to put more attention on a zone of my game that seems to be calling me more, and I'm basing that on the level of confusion that's generated by it. So whenever you're in that mode where you're wondering if you should continue to plod on in the direction that you've currently been going in, go play a session and become sensitive to where you're feeling insecure in game, and that'll give you a really good hint into what the next zone is that you might want to investigate. So eventually what happens is you break off a lot of different zones that you've identified insecurity with, you move toward the gray area substantially in each zone, and then you go back around for another iteration. So I think that's how you should do it. As a small stakes player who's trying to get to high stakes, you'll probably leave a lot of gray zone alone, meaning you'll probably leave a significant portion of each zone uncovered or unexplored so that you can move on to another zone that's worth more win rate to you. So win rate prioritization is a huge part of understanding how to explore this stuff efficiently. We could go into just a few textures that are good for bluff catching.
Sure.
A lot of it's intuitive though. Like
there's a few obvious ones.
Spots where draws miss.
Yeah, that when there's a flopped like open-ended straight flush draw, and deuce brick comes, he's gonna have a lot of unpaired hands.
It's almost too simple, and obviously it has nuances like as far deep as you want to go, but like the very simple, almost fish-based mentality is a lot of the bulk of the bluff catching win rate, because it's on a simple. This is actually like. Okay, so a lot of people would be like, okay, that's too simple to just call when draws miss. But realistically, if you're going to look at the probabilities of it, or if you look at like the Bayesian of it, it is far easier for someone to blast off too often when they have more bluffs in their range than it is for when they have a very few amount of bluffs in their range to choose from. So just on the raw impulse of someone potentially bluffing in this spot, it becomes harder for them to control their frequencies when they're looking down at a higher proportion of bluffs in their range on the river. So that's sort of the basis of it. Beginning to read textures with more subtlety is, I think, the skill of it, and that's what we're really sort of putting more attention on now that you guys are like totally integrated with metrics. Is let's go into the range versus range interaction subtleties that lend us to very efficient bluff catching spots in certain lines. A lot of that is developing into starting with turn check calls into river check calls, but really pattern recognizing. In this line, villain is much more likely to have a low bluff allowance that incentivizes a wide bluff catch because of this texture pattern. So I think that's the way to do it. Patternizing through textures and playing almost like a memory game like that. It's much more efficient. Did you see the thing that one of the students posted in the CFP chat the other day? It was something along the lines of like he was attempting to analyze a hand based on range distribution.
I did see that, yeah.
And I jumped in and I made a long post that said I don't think this is actually relevant.
Yeah.
So the student was making the mistake of thinking that it made sense to visualize every subsection of the opponent's range at each decision point in the hand. So it was a 3-bet pot where he c-bet out of position. He was using a 1/3 c-bet range strategy, and then he arrives on the turn, and his visualization process on the turn is breaking the opponent's range down into different subsections, but it's very vague. It was just something like he's got a bunch of strong hands, he's got some draws, and he's got some weak pairs. And when I'm looking at it, I'm saying, okay, well, that's not a thought process that I'm having when I'm playing a hand. Why is he having this? He clearly thinks there's some value in it, but when I look at that, it's vague enough that there's no value being offered in terms of how it can offer bluff catching efficiency. Basically because it's too qualitative. There's not enough quantitative aspects to it. It's just like his range is in 3 parts. Okay, but how does that help you bluff catch? If there's not a weight to that distribution, if there's not some sort of metric that you're funneling it through or filtering it down into to come to a decision, that's not really going to help you.
The range should be more intuitively understood once you get to a higher level where it's more integrated, and then you don't even have to. I mean, that shouldn't. It's just like a waste of thought process what he was doing in game.
I think that's true. That most of what happens at a high level of range versus range analysis is that the strength of the two ranges is intuitively understood, and it only becomes necessary to go into the micro ranging aspect in terms of splitting his range up into different distributions. It happens much less rarely, because what I'm seeing on turns more or less is I have a blueprint strategy that's mainly based on the quality of my hand, and then the rest of it, the bulk of the rest of it, is based on the texture orientation, the pattern of the texture. Because based on the pattern of the texture, I already know how it interacts with his range in that line. I think that's the main difference.
Yeah.
And I should probably follow up with that in the chat.
There's actually a couple things here from Gaz. Working with mental game issues, I find out that I keep fighting and resolving the same problems endlessly. I find that problem X and X is unhealthy perspective, paradigm, belief, and then I'm fixing it. I stay within this perspective for some time. Then after a few months, I catch myself coming back to old patterns. Because of that, my poker looks like a sinusoid where I really have really good periods and really bad periods.
What's a sinusoid? What is that word?
I have no idea, but I can look it up.
Don't worry about it. I get the gist.
Yeah.
So you're experiencing futility on the level of. We talked about this a little bit today, but
Yeah.
Okay, so there's this strange phenomenon for guys who have had experiences with futility, which is what this guy's basically outlining, where he's saying it feels like I solved the problem, and then it reintroduces itself later. A lot of what's probably happening is that you've convinced yourself that you solved the problem through some sort of external fix, except the core problem is never addressed, so it keeps reintroducing itself and perpetuating to futility, which is basically offering you incentive to go to the core pattern. So a lot of times you see this with guys who, this is like sort of like the bipolar symptom of the guy who's always on to the next thing, the guy who's always on either the next binge diet or the next poker strategy. The guy who never sticks with one thing for very long because he always thinks that the fix is external. I knew we were going to end up leading into this shit today. There's just no way around it. The fix starts with you, basically. And the thing that has become more clear to me in 2017 than basically anything, from working with more guys than ever and really keeping my ear to the ground and seeing like what's working and what's not and what patterns are developing with different people, it's this underlying trend of guys are not ready to take responsibility for the fact that the onus has always been on them. So how does that help in terms of identifying what the pattern is that's unhealthy and how I can actually root it out? Let's bring some context to it. I'm going to use a really common one, which is guys who are playing outside of their current bankroll. See a lot of urgency that runs rampant in the community around guys that either feel that they're entitled to play higher or guys that are desperate to establish financial security. It really doesn't matter which one it is, because both will establish an urgency in you that causes you to rationalize playing outside of your limits or your bankroll, and then pressure seeps in around that financial burden, playing outside of your limits, and that basically converts into a distorted thought process and then bad decision making, which is self-sabotage at its finest. So how do you get around that pattern? You start to, okay, so do this for a second. This is an exercise I was telling Alan today. Start with a sense of your overarching sense of your energetic set point, almost, your emotional set point. Where is my emotional set point over the course of the day, especially as it pertains to my poker career? And just visualize that and get a sense for how that feels. Does it feel confident? Does it feel like it comes from a stable posture? Or does it feel shaky and urgent and like it's frantic almost to prove something or to get some sort of security that it hasn't established yet for itself? If you're honest with this process, what you'll find is that to whatever degree it's relevant for you, there's a certain amount of energetic or emotional dissonance that's occurring in the body at any given time. That emotional dissonance is the culprit for every single decision, inaccurate decision or mistake that you've made over the course of your career. In other words, assuming that you knew better, and this is a big part of it. Like, a lot of you guys are making mistakes that you fundamentally know better. You know that you shouldn't be doing this thing. In other words, if I asked you from a stable place where you weren't susceptible to the pressure that was occurring in the moment from having this emotion flare up, you would be able to say, yeah, I understand that I shouldn't have probably played those limits. But then there's a rationalization that constantly takes place that sends you into the momentum of that, and that's what you need to get a handle on. The reason that this is occurring is because you have yet to take responsibility for the fact that there are emotions occurring in your body that are your fault, not reality's fault. It's not that there are obstacles out there that force me to have these feelings and I'm a victim to it. It's that you literally have continued to try to counter that negative energy in you, and it's only served to reinforce it. So this isn't even my opinion either. This is standard psychology shit. That if you try to counter a negative belief, I don't know why you would ever try to counter a positive belief, but any attempt to counter a belief will only serve to energize that belief. Because if you think about it, if you didn't believe that you were unable to get to high stakes, you wouldn't need to put affirmations in place to try to counter that belief. You would just embody the energy of someone who believed himself to be at high stakes, and that negative thought, that negative self-talk wouldn't register for you. So the key is to see how your attempt to try to get out of the paradigm that you're in is reinforcing the paradigm that you're in. That would make it seem like it's futile and that there's no way to get out of it, except there's one alternative. You surrender to the belief instead of fighting it. And that's the way out. It's the only way out that I understand in terms of the energetics of it, in terms of, it's almost vibrational law, I would say. It's emotional, energetic law. You cannot get out of a paradigm by engaging the paradigm head on. You have to surrender to the core belief that's perpetuating it, and then you can shoot through. And I think this is the biggest transition that a player can make in his career, because I'm honestly starting to believe, from working through a lot of different iterations of guys very closely, like I've done more micro work with students than ever in 2017, with CFP especially, to get to this conclusion that there is a standout variable that's not being paid enough attention to, and it's the variable of who's ready to take ownership of their emotions, because that's going to translate directly into the accuracy of the decision-making process. So basically, what I'm saying is you will not become a stable, winning, high-stakes poker player unless you're able to take responsibility for your emotions, and through that, basically your life. Every decision that you make has to come from a maturity that's rooted in seeing that there is more value in taking responsibility, even if that means admitting that I made mistakes, than there is in avoiding that process. Because what this guy is saying is, I've been experiencing futility through the avoidance of taking complete ownership. But it's very tricky how life can propose other alternatives that make it seem like you're stepping out of your paradigm, when really you're just exercising the same paradigm in a different type of zone. Like, it'd be like, oh, maybe this is the solution. I'll go try this external fix. But then you just pollute that with your internal imbalance, and it's the same thing. That's what futility actually is. And it's one of the most frustrating, confusing experiences to go through. Is like, how can my work ethic be so strong, and I'm trying to apply myself in all these different ways? This should be working, but nothing's falling into place. It's because you're fucking it up. Every time. I've started to come to this, I have this theory, I guess, that it is much easier to categorize a human in terms of his potential for success than people seem to let on. For instance, a lot of guys that approach me for staking recently are a little bit taken aback by how strict my terms are. Because of how much I've seen players self-destruct in the very small amount of time that I've been staking, which is really only like a year that I've been staking heavily, I've gone through a very accelerated learning curve of being able to take certain reference points of things that happened in the past with students, guys that I've been staking, and make it so that they're far less anecdotal than they seem. In other words, a lot of students would say, just because this thing happened with your student and it went wrong for him doesn't mean I should pay for that with stricter terms. When in fact, what I'm being more and more convinced of is that there are certain patterns in humans that when they show themselves, they are very, very strong indicators that that human does not have what it takes yet to succeed. And this thing about taking responsibility is one of them. That if you get any inkling that someone doesn't have the humility to take ownership over every single aspect of their career, run as far away from business investment with that person as possible, because they are almost on a guaranteed course to self-destruct at some point in the near future. A couple examples. This year I was staking a guy who was a verified 100 NL winner on a major site. He supplied a graph after I'd been working with him for some time where he was like a 4 BB winner or something at 100 NL over like 125,000 hands. You know who I'm talking about. So I moved this guy over to a softer site and I put him on a stake and I basically let him run with it. For about a month, he continues to show very volatile trends to the point where he's basically only putting up plus 15 or minus 15 buy-in sessions. So I'm seeing this because I'm in controlling the accounts, I can see them, and I'm seeing daily that the results are coming in really, really volatile. And I got my assistant on the other end who's saying, this is kind of a strange phenomenon. Like, could this style just be this high variance? And the signs were basically everywhere that this guy was on the verge of self-destruction through an urgency or self-sabotage. I knew that his life situation wasn't in order because I was lending him life funds, thinking that that would give him more stability. So basically, what this results in is the guy is like climbing back to break even. He's like always either plus or minus a few K for like a month straight, just up 3K, down 3K daily. And I tell my assistant, I say, all right, I'm gonna have to do something because this is a little too volatile at this point. Like, something's going on clearly. He was a winner and now he doesn't seem to be. This is like a 50,000 hand sample at this point. So I say, let's let him get to break even. He was down like 500 or something. I say, let's let him get to break even, and I'm gonna have a talk with him, and I'm gonna put him on pause until we figure out what's going on. In the next 48 hours, he punts off like between 10 and 15 grand. Like, totally implodes, and it was ironic in the sense that we were about to step in, and all the signs were there, and the guy even asked me for trust. Like, I made it apparent to him. I was like, yo, something's up, dude. Like, your results are different. I really want to make sure, like, you're okay. He's like, I got this. Just trust me. Boom. So that's one example of there was a pattern of volatility that if I was willing to take total responsibility as a staker, I should have stepped in and said, this pattern correlates enough with what I know to be emotional imbalance that there's some sort of deeper rooted issue here that needs to be addressed before we go on. So then the burden comes back on the backer. I hope there's some backers watching this because I think this could be a really cool talk on both ends of how the stakee needs to demonstrate more responsibility and how the backer can prevent a bad situation, not just for himself, but you're actually protecting the stakee. Like, I could have protected that guy from something that I saw coming, and I wanted to believe, like, oh, he's asking me for trust, and maybe this pattern doesn't apply to him. But I really think that this is the type of pattern, this pattern of urgency, that runs so deep and is so like self-confirming that it's not anecdotal, which means it's not just like, well, some guys will show this pattern and still be able to be successful. It's like, no, if a guy is showing urgency, he's on a path to self-destruction. I don't know when it's going to happen, but it's going to happen. Another example of a guy who asks for responsibility when he hasn't demonstrated it yet. I'm going to keep this anonymous, obviously, because I like this guy a lot too. So I remember I'm sitting at the DMV, and it was after a situation similar to a different situation where a student had basically punted off funds asking for responsibility. And at that point he owed me money, and there was problems with like him feeling like, you know, he wasn't ready to pay it yet for whatever reason. So I'm sitting and I'm texting one of my buddies who also backs, and I'm at the DMV. I'm getting registration put on my car. I have some time on my hands, and I'm just a little bit tilted, and I'm asking my friend, like, is it even possible to offer help to guys who don't want to take responsibility for their lives? And we're having like this discussion on how it's one of the most important things that we need to develop better sensitivity to before going into closer business with people is this a person who has actually taken extreme ownership over his decision making process in his life. So as this is going on, I get a random message from my Instagram account, and it's a guy who it was one of the guys that won a free Instagram pack that I gave away during the launch of Night Vision. And his message was, yo, I really need to talk to you for 10 minutes. Can I do it on Skype? So I'm like, all right, whatever. I give him my Skype, say hit me up on there. Next thing I know, this guy's got me on Skype, and he's saying, hey, I was a free winner from an Instagram pack a couple months back, but I never claimed the pack. I want to claim it, and I also would love 10 minutes of your time over a phone call because I have this thing that I need to talk about. So I'm at the DMV. I'm like, hey man, look, I'm in a loud place, and I'm not sure when I'm gonna have time to schedule 10 minutes on the phone. So why don't you just type it out to the best of your ability right now, and we'll talk. And he says, no, it's not gonna work because this is a difficult thing to talk about over text. I need to call you. So part of me is like, I would love to hear what this fucker's gonna ask me right now. Like, what does this guy think he's entitled to? A guy who didn't even claim a free pack now needs 10 minutes of my time so that he can give me, you know, the sob story, most likely. So I say, look, I can't do it. I say, I'm sorry, I don't have time right now, and let me know if you want to text, or maybe I can try to call you next week. So this is eating at me at the DMV, like to the point where I looked at my girlfriend, I'm like, okay, we're on the way home, and I'm driving, and I'm like, sorry, I just have to know. I like interrupt conversation with her. I call this guy up randomly on Skype. He's not expecting my phone call. He picks up, and I say, hey man, I found 10 minutes. What's up? This guy talks for like 10 minutes straight. I don't say a fucking word. I just let him basically tell his entire story, which was rooted in the sense of urgency and having consistently blown his bankroll. And I basically get the guy's whole life story in 10 minutes. And I'm driving home, so it's, you know, better this way, so I can focus, and I'm just listening. I pull into my driveway. I walk up the 4 flights of stairs. Guy is still talking. I put the phone down on the table. I say, okay, I need to talk now. And I said, you have to understand how you appear to me right now. You're someone who didn't even claim a free pack. And the punchline was, he did ask me for the steak. That's when I jumped in. I said, I need to say that something now. You are someone who didn't even claim a free pack in a free giveaway contest. And because you're under some financial pressure that you brought on yourself through your urgency, you have the balls to ask me for a steak. I said, here's what I will do. You can contact me 2 weeks from today after showing me that you haven't played a single hand of poker and that you've been focusing directly on ridding yourself of this urgency. Guy had a part-time job where he was making something like $800 or $1,000 a month, and he had a bankroll of $1,000. I said, your first task is not playing for 2 weeks straight. Prove to me you can do that. If you don't blow your bankroll in the next 2 weeks, message me on May 28th. I'll give you complete access to all of my training products for free. If you're still around in 3 months, in other words, if you work through the entire course and you still are here to text me in early August or September and say, I've worked through the packs, here's a small sample, check my stats, make sure everything's in line. If I see that level of dedication of you on a 4-month stable developmental program, I'll stake you. But that's the type of demonstration I'm going to need to see for someone I don't even fucking know. I don't even know who you are. And you're asking me for a stake. So basically my format for letting people get closer and closer in terms of giving them responsibility that they ask for is to make sure that they're demonstrating that they can handle it first. For a guy who's coming from an urgent mode, in other words, a guy who's recklessly punted off his bankroll in the past, that's the longest 4 months of his life. Like, he's got to want that really bad. He has to want that opportunity so bad that he takes responsibility for the fact that the pain of going in the other direction, the pain of not just bunkering down and taking this opportunity and doing what it takes to show the discipline, is going to actually be worse.
So what happened with him?
He hit me up May 28th, just like I asked him to, and he said, I'm still here. I haven't played a hand. I really want to be on the program. And I gave him free content, and he's going to be the guinea pig for this thing, basically.
Wow.
He's gonna basically go through the same CFP program that you guys went through.
Yeah.
I didn't tell you this yet, did I?
Uh-uh.
He's gonna go through the same CFP program that you guys went through, and we're gonna see if he's able to integrate it independently without all of the other emotional support
Oh, nice.
perks that have been involved in CFP along the way. I was telling Alan today that my other theory is that in the spirit of whether or not I want to continue putting out public packs, I made this announcement 2 weeks ago that we had 5 new packs that we're thinking about putting it out. After making that announcement, my team and I went through a series of deliberations where we're wondering if the community is actually at a level where public packs is the best option. In other words, there are some other alternatives. Let me run through how I see this. You put public packs out that don't give any amount of emotional support, and they only cater to the technical aspect of the game. So I give you the metrics and the understanding of equilibrium that is necessary for you to develop on the technical side as a player. Now, assuming your mental game is in order, that will work at a very high rate. But the problem is that it seems like almost 97% or more of the community has not crossed the threshold of wanting personal ownership over their career, which almost always converts into self-sabotage and blame of some sort. In other words, the student will hit a rough patch, and instead of owning it and basically barreling through it, he will find a way to rationalize that this obstacle is now in place that I can't get past, and it's not my problem. It never was my problem, so it must be some sort of outside factor that's the cause. I'm done. He hangs up the towel. Is that the right saying? Throws in the towel?
Yeah, throws in the towel.
And then he basically either gives up, burns out, or he takes the bipolar approach, which is it must be that the next course is the one. Similar to what your guy was asking over there. So, as a coach, if the intention is to help as many people as possible, which it's always been, contrary to popular belief of people posting in the blog lately, I have to now consider what is best in terms of a format or a structure for maximizing the amount of guys that I can get through this program by honoring the fact that there's this huge variable that's not being addressed, which is the variable of mental game stability, taking responsibility for all of the little downswings that occur and the distortional effects of stress as it gets put on the psyche through this career, which unfortunately or fortunately is highly stressful. So here's my guesstimate. 1% of the players that pick up my pack will actually be able, 1 to 3% will be able to get through it alone because they're already at a threshold where they've taken enough responsibility over their life that the mental aspect of it won't corrupt their learning pattern. 1 to 3%. Now, if there was special attention paid to a group of players in the form of a CFP group where there were safety nets in place and admins watching over, sort of like what we have in CFP1, we have Eye in the Skies. I've got 3 different guys who are all basically pilots, more or less, of that group and being able to say, okay, this student seems to be struggling with this, basically calling my attention to when we have a problem, more or less. And we have stuff like guys working with Elliot Rowe, poker mind coach. Like, at the point at which the student progresses in the program, he begins working with a therapist on his mental game, along with all of the other group call stuff that we're doing weekly, along with the side group calls that he's doing with his teammates. So there's a high degree of accountability that's generated in an intimate program like this, where we've really tried to make it bulletproof from a lot of different angles so that the student has support anywhere he looks. If I take that aspect out of it, suddenly there's a huge gap in the program for anyone who understands how important mental game is. You talk to a lot of people and they'll be like, well, if the program is good, then you should still be able to get through it all the same. It's not how it works, because the aspect of mental game regression is such a severe one that's so overlooked that and it's probably such a culprit because it's so overlooked. Like, if there was more awareness around how poor of a player you become when you have outside stressors put on you in the form of a downswing or just some shit goes down in your life that you're not prepared for, if there was actually awareness generated around that, people would be more prepared for when it happened, because they'd be able to see, this is what Nick talked about in his stream. This is going on right now. I'm in the midst of the fire of mental distortion. I can chill out and not punt my roll off while I deal with this. But there's not an awareness around it. If anything, where the community is at is, my win rate is my win rate, and it will always be my win rate no matter what type of mental condition I'm in. It's the highest arrogance. So if I'm going to put out public packs and take away the intimacy of a program, I basically take away a large percentage of the people that I can convert into winners.
I would say firsthand it would have been really, really hard to succeed at this program without the intimacy and accountability we had generated from the whole group aspect.
I think it tripled the results,
Absolutely.
at least.
It
could be even more than that.
It would have been really difficult, honestly, to succeed, especially at the capacity that we did succeed. I mean, it would have been tough to get through without that.
So it makes me wonder, is it worth even putting out public packs anymore when I have such a low conversion rate? Or is it worth doing something different? And I don't know what that is yet, because here's the catch. The intimate format doesn't scale well. In other words, if I'm going to go on a trip, like the Athens trip was very, very formative in your guys' experience as a team. We basically spent a week together in a house, and there was a lot of deep life talk. A lot of guys wearing their heart on their sleeves and saying, I'm at a stage in my life where I need to make a transition, and this is the time, because I've never felt this amount of emotional pain. Like, this was like a last chance trip. Like, that's what I would call it. Is like, I'm speaking to you from the other side of having taken ownership in this department of my life as a professional, and guys are starting to see, okay, he's speaking from somewhere. I'm not sure where he's speaking from. You guys didn't know me that well. You probably still think I'm like some sort of a madman at this point, but you can sense that I'm speaking from somewhere. And I think you were drawn to the energy that I was speaking from enough to trust me that I was speaking from somewhere real. I'm not just pulling the shit out of my ass.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you saw that, I think what it created a camaraderie within each of you that was like, all right, we want to do this. We're making the decision that this is the direction we want to go in. We've assessed the situation with our own eyes enough that if we were ever going to follow someone on a path, we want it to be this guy. And then there was that trust and loyalty that developed, which was very healthy for the whole relationship dynamic.
Oh, yeah.
And then we basically structured it so that it was bulletproof on every single end of it. You guys had massive accountability to each other. I had massive investment in you guys because I took a staking arrangement that was technically outside of my ability to be able to fund, because I believed in you guys so much. And then we made a transition onto a softer site where they took off immediately. And things have been green ever since. But there was a lot of trust on all ends developing that relationship, and I think that's what created the massive leverage behind it. So if I take that out, I take away a huge incentive out for the student to succeed. Whether it be because he doesn't have the level of accountability or the emotional support. It could be all different types of things that guys respond to, but there's something about the intimacy of a program like that that seemed to convert at a much higher rate. It doesn't scale because I can't go on a trip with 5 guys and spend a week. I can't scale that. I'm only one person. So either I find a way to have guys who are equally as dedicated to emotionally supporting and being able to talk guys through these types of thresholds. Either I find a team that can do that and scale it, or we're stuck basically having to have very small circles, or we're reverting to public packs where the conversion rate to success is much lower. So that's where we're at right now. For the time being, it's looking like we're delaying the public packs while we try to figure this out, because I just think that it's more, I feel like it's more relevant. Like I can't put it any other way, that now that I've been made aware of how much of a factor this mental game and taking extreme ownership and the support of a community is in a training program, I have to start to question how efficient my packs would be, because I'm holding this in opposition to it now. I see what just happened when guys have the proper amount of support and camaraderie and trust and loyalty, and it just doesn't make as much sense to me to put something out that might actually. So here's the catch. Say I help 1% of people with a public product. That number might actually be substantial. There might be a community of 100 guys that I reach through that. So it's something that is sort of up in the air right now. And I wanted to just be transparent about where we're at with it, because it has always been at the forefront of my vision to have the highest integrity program that is serving the community to the best of my ability. And if I start to get feedback from my adventures in staking and coaching that there is a format that is much more effective, I need to investigate whether or not I can functionally scale that format. And that's basically where my attention is right now. Is it seems impossible to scale, but what if we could? What if somehow we could create a community that has that much attention and love injected in it that it's able to convert at that high of a rate? That'd be something I'm very interested in.
I mean, it's possible it could exponentially grow. I mean, it should.
It should, but it needs more. It needs a bigger army of guys who have already taken full responsibility, so they can serve as beacons
Right.
for other people to basically see and look up to and say, I know this is possible. This guy is speaking from somewhere.
If one of 5, so we had 5 people in Athens, if one of 5 converts to that person, they could, control another group of 5, and then you get one from there. So that's, I mean, it's possible.
No, and it's something that I've been thinking about. Like, all right, so there's going to be graduates of CFP, guys that have completed profit goals and moved on to high stakes. One of the things I was considering is holding seminars where all the CFP graduates come, and if there's 6 of us, we can give a lot of support individually to a 20-25 person group over the course of 4 days, because there's just more of us. I probably can learn everybody's name overnight, and then maybe pull each of them aside for an hour over the course of a 4-day seminar, and the rest would be public lecture.
Yeah.
But if we have 6 dudes, and each of you are assigned 3 guys, there's a lot more we can do with that.
Oh, yeah.
So,
We got another question here.
yeah, go ahead.
Say you're in a place where you're humble and ready to learn. How do you optimize study throughout a day, week, and a month so that you don't suffer from information overload and what you're learning actually settles in your mind and becomes permanent knowledge?
Great question.
Finding time to put in hours. Also study hand histories, do some PO work, spot leaks in your own game, and to start to learn new tools like hand to note. Just feels basically that what I get is the guy's a little overwhelmed with all the information overload.
Yeah.
So it's like there's just so many areas to improve.
How do you
There just
pick?
there aren't enough hours in the day.
Yeah. So you have to go back to that Pareto's law thing, which can be hard if you're not at a level already where you trust yourself to identify what is the most important 20% that will get me 80% of the results. If you're completely clueless, which you really shouldn't be with the amount of content available, like, okay, one of 2 things needs to happen. Either you need to go and absorb as much content as possible and make the judgment call of which direction you trust. That doesn't even mean that you need to go all in on a single coach. You can have selections of material from multiple coaches that seem to resonate with you that can build your blueprint learning pattern for you. This is the independent model, which you need to be able to use, because if you're going to use a forum, For instance, take Run It Once or Upswing or any of the forums that hold Upswing doesn't do this, right? They have like a more of a path, I guess.
I don't know actually.
Okay, but take Run It Once, for instance. If you're going to utilize Run It Once correctly, you have to be the one that makes the call on which coaches you're going to basically go all in on in terms of constructing the content that you're going to study from. Or what you could do is take multiple ideas from a bunch of different coaches. That would be the dependent independent way, because you're still basically looking to a coach to give you ideas or zones that you can prioritize. From that material, you then construct your streamlined learning program, and you basically devote certain hours of the day to each zone, like I said before, where you're working out from the black and white area, chunking it to get the highest priority win rate out of those zones, and then once you get close enough to gray area, you move on to another zone. You just do iterations of that. Now say you're completely clueless, either because you don't have subscriptions to sites, or you didn't know that I have 60 hours of free YouTube content that you could just go cruise at your leisure. Say you don't want to take anyone's advice. This is actually the situation I was in sort of in 2015 when I disconnected completely from the industry, and I had hit rock bottom with the feudal pattern of trying to over apply theory, and I said I've got to try something completely. I need to reinvent myself basically, and I started on pure inspiration alone. Luckily, I had an aid, which was Bovada at the time. I was playing on Bovada, and the hole cards were exposed. So I was starting to see a lot of spots that didn't seem to operate the way that I thought with how villains were playing, and that was my launching pad for how I wanted to independently investigate spots that were very confusing to me. Like, how is this thing happening how is he bluffing in this spot that I didn't think was over bluffed, but apparently is. So if you don't have any resources, go play a session and jot down the 3 most painful spots you found yourself in. Prioritize those zones and create a path around iterations of doing this. You can find out so much just from being honest with yourself. Record a 30-minute session, and when you go back and you talk yourself through the analysis, call bullshit on yourself. Where am I talking out of my ass in this analysis? I clearly don't understand this concept well enough that I'm trying to articulate. All right, I'm going to post that one up on the wall, and I'm going to come back to it. I'm going to organize a blueprint out of these spots that are so confusing to me.
That's so helpful.
This is what I recommended. I forget where I said this recently. I think I said it on a Twitch stream, where much of my developmental process was me sitting with a headset on, annotating a session right after I played it. Then I would go do something like go for a walk, come back, redo it. Then I would wake up the next morning, listen to both, go for a walk, and do a hyper analysis, which would be the hybrid pieces of everything I thought that I wasn't bullshitting myself on from the other two. And what would come from that was, through iterations of humility in calling bullshit on my own voiced analysis, I became a new version of myself analytically, just by being honest about where I knew I was talking out of my ass and eliminating those sentences from my vocabulary. You can do it that way. It requires a higher level of humility, but it's possible if you care enough about truth. And the alternative, which is what I'm very focused on now, is, okay, for guys that aren't capable of this for whatever reason, if you haven't reached a leverage point yet where you're all in on trying something new, or you haven't reached a point yet where you trust yourself enough to just make the call on what direction you want to go in, that is when a course that is very metric oriented and set up in a way that's almost spoon-fed could help a lot more people. The technical side of it is very spoon-fed. It is sequenced in a way that works, but it still doesn't have the mental game aspect that's going to get you through the door. That part is still left out. So that's my aversion to putting a product like that out there, is, am I actually just enabling the guy who doesn't want responsibility yet to try another method that's only going to get him half or 3/4 of the way before he basically punts off again? That's basically the question that sort of plagues me as a strategy developer right now and a coach, is, am I actually just enabling guys to continue their pattern by proposing that I have the most spoon-fed metric-oriented course that you could follow step by step? Because my whole model as a coach that I think stands out to people is that I'm an advocate of independent learning. So now I'm going to put a pack out that is completely spoon-fed, which on the surface, might actually be very helpful if this mental game side of it wasn't such a huge variable. There's actually just no way around it anymore to acknowledge the fact that the technical aspect of it is falling short. There's no reason that half the guys on CFP should turn from losing players to high-stakes winners, and then the other half are just struggling to piece it together.
Absolutely.
It can't be the content at that point. It has to be something to do with the pattern of the human that is losing vision somewhere along the way.
It's an internal struggle, but on top of that, like you say that you're like enabling them to basically use that as a scapegoat to like from taking full responsibility, but you're still getting them like half or three-quarters to where they want to be.
Yeah.
So there has to be some validity in that.
There is. So that's the thing is, maybe it's worth it just to get guys to the point where they've handled the technical aspect of it, so that there's a little bit less of a burden on them taking full responsibility for the mental game side.
That's true.
If I just had the tools, speaking as a student who wants a spoon-fed magic pill, if someone just gave me the tools, I could follow it to Graceland. That's how I used to think. Is like, the reason I created Detox was because I didn't have the type of path that I thought I could have excelled from. And I said, if I ever figure this shit out, I will leave a path that someone could follow. But even then, I was stubborn in thinking that the mental game wasn't as huge a part of it as it actually is. So if you could argue that if a student just had the technical aspect of it dialed, that it would give him enough leverage by reducing enough stress that he could begin to take ownership of the other half of it, of what's required to actually consistently succeed, then yeah, it would be very worth doing that. But in a lot of ways, and I think this is going to go over a lot of people's head who aren't ready to hear this, in a lot of ways, the technical side of the game has always been the excuse you've used for the bigger issue, which is that you're a fuck up. Like, you've been the one all along sabotaging yourself, and there might have been worse courses that you could have applied and still succeeded at if you were just more independent. The beauty of a bad course is in your ability to discern that it sucks. This is why I don't even agree with all of the shit out there that's like, oh, these courses are manipulative. These are scam courses, and because there are scam courses out there, we have to be skeptical of every next course that comes out or every next coach. If you're someone who's wasting time identifying or blaming every opportunity for potentially being manipulative, you're actually just outing yourself as a person who doesn't trust himself to not get manipulated. It's a huge issue that goes way over guys' heads, especially the trolls that are posting virtually everywhere blaming the scam coaches. If you have time to blame a scam coach, it basically means that you are perceiving vulnerability in that avenue, which means you don't have the intelligence to discern when you're getting manipulated. That's a huge problem. If you don't trust yourself enough to not get manipulated and discern where there's well-balanced exploration available in terms of learning, that's something that you need to handle before you venture off onto any path, because it's self-confirming. It's a paradigm in itself that's going to always manifest as placing blame on another person for when you can't handle the pressure. What else do you have over there, Alan?
I got nothing.
Is it worth talking about gun to the head?
Gun to the head is probably going to end up being broken down. Like, this is basically gun to the head. I was going to do that lecture, and now I'm not sure I'm going to do it if we don't put these packs out. Gun to the head was going to be the intro lead into the pack launch, basically, where I was going to do a 1-hour lecture basically simulating the only form of urgency that you should be putting on yourself, which is, am I ready to make complete change? Gun to the head, could you do it if I put a gun to your head? The only form of urgency that actually ignites humility. All other forms of urgency are rooted in avoiding making the humble choice. Gun to the head is basically, could you take the humble choice if I put a gun to your head? In other words, you've been avoiding it all along. Let's simulate an experience where the alternative is death. Could you do it? Because if you could, then you've been bullshitting yourself all along. And the only thing that's been standing in your way has been a lack of incentive. So I'll give you the incentive, or I was trying to simulate it by...
What's perfect about that is you have to accept all responsibility at that point. When the gun's to your head, you are saying, I'm putting every bit of myself into this that I can to succeed. Or succeed's not even the right word, but I just need to do the best that I'm capable of
I need to
doing.
find out what my full potential is, because the alternative is death. So this is the beauty of gun to the head. It's not even demanding that you succeed.
Mm-hmm.
It's just demanding that you put your full fucking potential on the table by constantly staying moving instead of stagnating. And going back to like one of the first questions, this guy's asking, it seems like I'm trying all this different shit, but the patterns are reemerging. It's because you're not changing the core posture. You're still actually in the same paradigm. You're just confusing yourself by attempting different outward ways to manipulate your reality from the same inward posture. It's one of the most frustrating things to experience, because it really seems like you're doing something different, but you're doing it from the same place. And it's fundamentally obstacled, not by anything out here, but by the self-sabotaging energy that perpetuates inwardly. The only way through is humility. This is why, in a way, I have some sort of faith in the fact that the universe is set up by some sort of higher order. Because how interesting is it that the only way to ascend paradigms is to completely surrender the thought that you knew how it worked? What an intelligent game that would be to make sure that you completed the level. If the only way that you can complete the level is by asserting enough humility in the direction of what you do not know, that's how you get the key to the next level. We talked about that in Athens.
That's pretty sick. That's one of my favorite topics to even think about.
The game of life.
Talking about that and talking about how you're actually reinforcing your own paradigm when you try to combat it. Like, those two things are really difficult to understand or talk about, but like if they have the most win rate upgrades available in them, honestly. Like life win rate. So much upgrade in understanding that or trying to.
We talked about it a little bit at lunch, how like it might actually be impossible to logically understand it. And how funny is it that that's how it's set up too? That you can't even logically get it until you experience it through the humble thrust, basically. Like, you can't think your way into this type of understanding, and the only way to get there is to demonstrate enough humility to allow yourself to basically shift. You're basically shifting energy into a space where suddenly it makes sense. But it doesn't make sense up here, it makes sense experientially, and then through the experience it confirms that, oh, it actually is safer and wiser over here. I can live here. This isn't as scary as I thought, to surrender this amount of control over what I thought I knew. But how interesting is it that if it's set up in a way where you can't logically get there, it demands the highest demonstration of humility, because that territory is guarded very efficiently. If the higher territory, the wiser territory, the freer domain is guarded by demonstration of humility, there's no way to cheat it. Doesn't matter how fucking smart you are, because as smart as you are, you can only reinforce the paradigm that you're in, unless you want to get wise. And then wisdom is surrender. It's getting pretty spiritual.
What do we got here? I think it says the scary thing for most people to do, if I put myself out there and my full potential isn't enough and I still fail, I'm a failure. So most people would rather keep the illusion of I gave it my all, I would succeed. If I gave it my all, I would succeed.
I just realized we're not live on Facebook. We never hit the go live button.
Are you serious?
But it's okay, because it'll be recorded on Twitch. Can you repeat the question?
It's not really a question. It's basically just saying that that's the scary thing for most people. Like if I put myself out there and my full potential isn't enough and still fail, I'm a failure. So most people would rather cling to the illusion of if I give it my all, I would succeed. Like they cling
Yeah.
to that statement. Like okay, I'm going to give it my all, so maybe I'll succeed. So therefore, again, it's just kind of like a lack of taking responsibility for.
Like kidding yourself,
Yeah,
basically,
right.
that because I didn't go all in completely, I might still be able
Right.
to have it in me.
Giving yourself an out,
Right.
basically.
Like I didn't put it all on the line,
Yeah.
but I could have.
Yeah, and you keep bringing up like humility. You have to be really wise and keen and aware of your emotions and understand that you're not going to know everything, and just because you don't understand something doesn't mean that you're wrong in any way, shape, or form. It's just
Oh, I think that's actually a huge point, is being self-forgiving on the path and not developing this very what seems to be a natural guilt that develops in the learning process if you're not having the progress that you think you should have. Almost like a personal resentment for yourself.
yeah.
Like, why the fuck can't I figure this out? With all the resources available and with everything I've been taught from problem solving so far, why can't I actually make this work for myself? And then there starts to be beliefs generated around that get really deeply entrenched, like I'm not able.
I had that really bad for a while, actually. I just kept thinking I was running terribly or something, and I couldn't accept that I hadn't like made more money, or I wasn't a bigger consistent winner with all the work I'd put forward. I felt entitled to it.
That's actually a big one.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, they can let your dog in. Keeps giving sad faces.
I don't want him out
Let
here
the dog
because
in. Okay.
he might bark and that's gonna annoy me. We'll chill with him in a second. Um, that thing about entitlement is one of the bigger things I had awareness brought to lately, where I dealt with several students who I at first believed they had an unworthiness complex, and that was why they were chasing so hard. Again, back to the urgency. But it can actually surface in two forms. They're both the same thing. On one hand, you can have an urgency that's rooted in unworthiness, like, I'm not good enough, I'm not able to do this yet, I should be able to. That's an inferiority complex. The other end of it is the guy who is disguising his unworthiness through entitlement.
Yeah.
In other words, I should be able to be playing higher. I deserve to be playing higher, though he's done nothing to demonstrate to himself or his environment that he actually has what it takes. It's just a thought in his head that he's probably just come from a more like empowered upbringing where people told him like you can do whatever you want, but he's still got this deep-seated belief of like, yeah, but I haven't yet, and I don't want to fail, but I'll act entitled because through acting entitled I can actually maybe convince myself.
Yeah, you're not addressing the core issue.
There's still the same core issue. So it's weird how you can establish yourself on either side of that polarity. You can be the straight up victim, or you can be the guy who's entitled, but both are rooted in the same core imbalance, which is I'm not able. I don't believe myself to be able. That's why I need to overcompensate with entitlement or default toward just victimization.
Every time they do either one of those, they're just reinforcing that paradigm.
Every time they believe either one, that they're a victim or they're entitled, they're reinforcing the core belief that they're fundamentally unworthy or not able. So the key to this is seeing that you cannot fundamentally counter a belief. It's impossible. It's like it's almost energetic law, like I said before. Countering a belief can only reinforce it. So if you see the futility in that, at first it seems hopeless, but then there's this out. Your only out is surrender to the fact that on this level of this belief, I am actually fundamentally unable, but only from the level of this belief. And then you can choose to release that belief.
Yeah, you have to find a way to let that belief go and just completely erase it from your internal being.
That's what I don't know how to train, and it's still something I'm working on myself. You go through iterations and iterations of this. Like I don't necessarily have this anymore in poker, although on my I'm pushing toward nosebleeds right now, sort of on the low. Been playing a lot of heads up lately, and I see that this is resurfacing where I have to be very careful that the more pressure is exerted from higher and higher stakes, these themes start to reintroduce themselves and they demand attention. That's why I've been meditating like 4 hours a day, because I want responsibility over those emotions. Because if anybody should have enough evidence of what the fuck happens if I disobey, it's me. Like, I see way too much self-sabotage underneath me to accept that level of laziness from myself. So my journey right now is extremely inward, in the sense that I'm trying to juggle how to serve the most people with a course that I think is really well designed, but also acknowledging that there's a huge part left out in the public arena of not establishing the type of program that has the support system necessary for growth. And then on my private journey, scaling towards nosebleeds and seeing how that pressure gets re-exerted onto me, and then dealing with it on a personal level so I can deepen my understanding of it. I'm firing on a bunch of different cylinders right now.
When we were just talking by the pool today, it's just like I came up with something like you kind of have to downgrade before you can actually upgrade. You can't keep forcing that upgrade. Sometimes you have to take one step back in order to take a giant leap forward.
Yeah, like it's accepting that it's time to play smaller limits while you rebuild your confidence or your momentum. It's a huge thing. Like we talked about this today, where I said, what would be the most painful thing for you to do right now? And we agreed it would be to actually take time off.
Yeah.
That's what you should do.
Yeah.
Because you're in most resistance to it.
Right.
Which means it's the thing that would serve to not counter your core belief that's bothering you, but actually disengage it. The thing that you're in most resistance to is the direct path to disengaging the belief that's operating the false paradigm, or the flawed paradigm. The imbalance of your paradigm can always be spotted by sensing for the thing that you're in most resistance to. If it's that I don't want to take time away from the game, well, then I must have an urgency in me that seems to think that I can get security from rushing my results and potentially running hot,
right,
winning 10 grand, and then having more money to pay rent with. Most of you already have that. That's the thing. A lot of you, if I put your situation in perspective, are not in a position where you're like strapped for rent. And those of you that are, you need to get even more serious about this, because you're in more dire straits. You need to come with an even higher level of composure that takes even more responsibility for how shitty your situation is currently. No matter how many excuses you have for how you got there, it has never been more important for you to take 100% responsibility than the month that you cannot afford to have a losing month. That might not even look like poker. I've talked about this before, where like taking full responsibility can look a lot of different ways. It can look like asking for a loan to the one person that might still think that you're worth it. All of it takes the same amount of humility. What's up, new follower? Thanks for joining us, but you're late. Guys, this will be uploaded to YouTube shortly after. Just going to produce it and throw it up. I think I'm going to call it, and we can go get dinner somewhere. But I'm happy with how this turned out. I knew it was going to go in this direction, kind of. But I'm glad I had you guys here to kind of help it along, because it's sort of been the talk of the stable recently, is like, do we really, really want this level of responsibility that's necessary to cross the next threshold?
Yeah, and that level of responsibility is, it's not looking outward, it's looking inward at what you struggle with the most.
Yeah.
And then doing the opposite of what you think you should do when you're in that struggle state.
Counterintuitive as usual.
Right.
Hey, I'm going to steal 30 seconds of everybody's time. I want to give a shout out to my dad because it's his birthday, and I want to give a shout out to my mom because she got 4th place in that tournament.
Yes.
For $250.
What do you got? 20% of her?
20%, baby. So like.
Mom's playing World Series events.
Quite the payday.
A couple of quick things here. Is goal setting something you do personally, or only something that that you're part of as CFP? Do you find that a lot of your CFP students, do you find a lot of your CFP students ask questions that they haven't bothered to work through themselves? like me coming, like when you picked me up today, like I fucking told you exactly what I was struggling with. So basically, like, are the CFP students like transparent with their issues?
Transparent, yes. Do they sometimes use me as a crutch to solve problems that they could probably get more perspective on if they spent more time inward? Yes. And it's one of the things that I would like to figure out a solution to. There really is none, because if a guy's working towards taking full responsibility, part of the side effect of that is that he will portion off his personal introspection onto someone else in that process, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I think I just have a biased opinion of it, because when I have 12 different guys pinging me for mental emotional help, that can take a toll on me in a way that I'm not able to provide the best responses. See what I mean?
Yeah.
So in a way, it's my fault, not your guys' fault. If I'm going to take on 12 students, I should either put a system in place that has someone set up to talk to. Like, that's why I hired Elliot. That's why I'm spending, like, I don't know, stupid amounts of money a month on having Elliot work with the guys in the stable who are advanced, is so I don't have to be that outlet for them.
Yeah.
And I think that's worth it. Even though on paper it looks fucking ridiculous to be portioning out this much money on therapy. Talk to Logan, he said this one session with Elliot literally saved me like $10,000 this month.
Yeah.
And I believe it,
Sick.
because I talked to other backers who work with him too. And they're all saying the same thing, that like it's worth its weight in gold to just solve one or two issues.
Yep.
So that's one thing that I would definitely recommend if you're not working with a mind coach of some sort. Check out Elliot Rowe. I really think he's the best in the business at what he does. And I'm more and more believing every day that that sector of the business is where the bulk of the win rate potential is. And I think it's being neglected, or at least not being put in its proper place for how much it's actually worth.
Yeah, it's not an easy solution, but like if you have this issue where you don't know what your inward struggle is, there's outlets in order to understand what that is, and then you can just take the steps necessary to work from there once you get like a blueprint or a direction on where to go.
Yeah, and I think the really cool thing about Elliot is that his line of questioning is so direct that it doesn't leave you much room to bullshit yourself. That's what I love about it. It's a very masculine approach. I guess if you were going to talk about it more of like in terms of sort of masculine or feminine in terms of like the introspective process, it's much less of like I don't feel like it's gentle, but maybe that's because I go into it wanting a lot of responsibility from it. Usually we get right to the heart of shit, and it puts you in a really tough position to answer a very uncomfortable question that you've been avoiding for some time. That being said, he's also one of the most non-judgmental people. Like, you can sense it, that he genuinely wants to just help, and there's no judgment coming your way, which is very comforting. So I think it's a really nice balance in that way. Someone who wants to go deeply inward and get to the bottom of their shit, but not feel as though they're being judged or forced in the process. All right, guys, I'm going to call it. I'm going to try to keep this slot once a week. I like doing it at this time, too, because it's nice out, for sure.
It is nice.
Continue to post questions in the blog on Run At Once if you'd like something answered. I'll try to get through as many of those as possible. Good luck as usual, and try to focus on clarifying the mental side of things in the next week. I think that the benefits are fruitful, to say the least. See you guys.